Dipty's here with the papers. Not surprising as well, the international papers, of course. We talked about the French ones earlier, but the international papers are also focusing on the French election, aren't they, Dipty?
Focusing, and they have a lot of words of advice to one candidate in particular. That's Emmanuel Macron, Stuart. The Guardian, the British daily, says, take nothing for granted. Macron needs to come out of his comfort zone to show that he understands just how divided France is right now and shows that he intends to reconcile those differences ahead of the May 7th runoff vote. The New York Times writer Roger Cohen has one word of advice to Macron: work. Mr. Macron, work. Disruption is in the air in France, he says, and Macron will have to win the runoff. He can't just expect Marine Le Pen to lose it. Macron's worst enemy could be his arrogance, he says, and his challenge will also be tempering his innovative instincts with a, quote, heavy dose of Gallic solidarity. In other words, he has to make sure that he keeps his program France-friendly if he wants to win. His mantra now should be work, boldness, humility.
What about the rest of the foreign press? What are they saying?
Well, let's look at Die Welt, the German paper, in an article called Macron's Mammoth Task. The paper actually compares the presidential candidate to Barack Obama in terms of the energy and enthusiasm that both men managed to draw out from crowds. But Obama's example, the paper says, should teach Macron that it's judicious to remember there's a difference between what is said and what is done. Now, let's look at the Belgian newspaper De Morgen, which warns that Macron is only a favorite in the runoff because, I quote, his greatest quality is not being Le Pen. And finally, let's end on a cartoon because, of course, if Emmanuel Macron wins, he could be the youngest president in French history. As you see in this cartoon, he'd be France's baby president, his presidential convoy there with a warning sign, baby on board.
Oh, very, very cute. Some of the papers, they're also focusing on Marine Le Pen as well, aren't they?
Of course, not surprisingly, one coming from the Russian paper, a pro-Kremlin Russian paper, which really backs Marine Le Pen and calls Macron a darling of the French and Anglo-Saxon media, and says French voters must choose between, I quote, a slow decay and a fierce combat, which I assume is between Macron and Le Pen. Now, for the Singaporean newspaper, the Straits Times, Marine Le Pen campaigns much better than Emmanuel Macron, and the paper also notes that her supporters are much more fiercely loyal to her, and they're more likely to turn out in droves to vote for her in the runoff. Whereas Macron supporters sort of come from a base of hodgepodge supporters, voters, some who are loyal, some who feel they have no choice against the far right. And even within Europe, we see that there's sort of this dilemma about how to back the candidates. Jean-Claude Juncker, the president of the European Commission, and EU foreign policy chief Federica Mogherini have both rushed to endorse Macron, even if it really breaks with EU policy of not interfering in national elections. But this is an election like no other. And when you have a candidate who's obviously against the EU, it seems like a no-brainer for EU leaders to get involved.
Now, moving on to Donald Trump. He's given an interview to the press agency Associated Press. It's been called baffling, this interview, by some of the media, hasn't it?
Well, the Huffington Post has called it baffling, and they've pulled out 7 of the most baffling moments from his interview. The publication says, so many words, so little sense. And you can actually get a full transcript, if you're curious, of that interview online, in which Trump says he has the best chemistry with Angela Merkel, the German chancellor. I'm not sure if she'd agree. At one point, he interrupts himself to generously offer a beverage to the AP reporter. This is mid-sentence while he's talking about something. Yeah. He also admits that when he attacked NATO during his presidential campaign, he didn't actually know what they did. So I assume now he does, Stuart.
Well, he's changed his mind now, obviously.
He's changed his mind. He's probably read up on it since becoming president. He also flip-flops on the cost of his controversial wall with Mexico, saying, oh, now it's going to cost about $10 billion or less, even though estimates say it could be double. The Washington Post has published a really searing piece on his wall plans, saying Trump thinks we're all hopelessly naive. He now wants taxpayers to foot the bill with the, quote, vague promise that Mexico will ante up in some form at some future date. Washington Post says, like never.
Perhaps they had some chocolate cake while they were doing the interview. It all comes as well as Trump is approaching 100 days in office now.
That's right, 100 days in office, maybe 100 days too many for some of his critics. The Guardian has interviewed Trump critics to see how they're coping, what are their coping mechanisms. Some say they've increased financial support for minority organizations that might be sidelined by the new administration. Others say they're listening to NPR, meditating, but some have more drastic coping mechanisms. One man says he's drinking whiskey. Mm-hmm. Another man says it's gin and ginger for him. As they say, drink in moderation. There's still another 3.5 years left of this presidency.
I got to say, all we get at this time of day is a glass of water, and if you're lucky, a cup of coffee. But there you go. We'll keep covering it anyway. It's a lot of Dipsy and Brian on France 24.